Hey guys, it's Yuta. So many people ask this question. Why is Japan's birth rate so low? But it's not exactly a simple question. First of all, what we should be looking at is the total fertility rate, which is the average number of children that a woman has in her lifetime. The total fertility rate, or the TFR, is useful when you think about how it affects the population. Now, how many children does a woman need to have on average if you want to maintain the population size? 2, right? Because roughly half the population is men and the other half is women. And the actual number is something like 2.1 for developed countries, and this is called the replacement rate. So any country below this rate has potentially a shrinking population, and according to the World Factbook's 2016 estimates, 119 countries are below this rate. And many people think that Japan has the lowest fertility rate in the world, but that's actually not the case. Japan's position is pretty low, but many countries have a similar TFR. For example, Germany's fertility rate is 1.44, which is pretty close to Japan's 1.41. So why don't we hear about Germany's shrinking population? Well, the answer is immigration, right? Because in many developed countries, immigrants compensate for their low TFRs. The United States, the United Kingdom, Sweden, it's the same story. And that's why there's a huge backlash against immigrants in many countries today. The flip side of this is that many countries have far worse population problems because people are leaving their countries. Emigration. So European countries like Greece, Ukraine, or Serbia have faster shrinking populations. So there's actually nothing really special about Japan's fertility rate or the shrinking population. But of course that doesn't change the fact that Japan's fertility rate is pretty low. But the question is, it's low compared to what? And if you compare it to our neighbors, Japan's TFR is actually higher than South Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and only mainland China has a higher TFR. But if you compare it to Europe, it's lower. But it's not that straightforward because countries like Germany has a similar fertility rate. There's also many variables that may correlate with fertility rates. For example, women's years in school, child mortality rates, working hours, the average age at first birth, Human Development Index, just to name a few. So this topic can get very complicated. But in this video, I'm going to take a very simple approach. Let's just compare Japan to one other country, because this way I can illustrate Japan's culture pretty well. And I'm going to choose France, because France is one of Japan's favorite examples of a country that managed to increase its fertility rate, and many Japanese people writing about it. So analyzing what Japanese people are saying about France can be very insightful. And the first point is the cost of raising kids. According to the government statistics, the most common reason why people are not having as many babies as they want is very clear. Money. Economic reasons are constantly number one, and people are even earning less compared to 10 years ago. So Japanese people are saying that they would get more support from the government in France, which seems to be true. Japan also offers child benefit, but France seems to have more options, especially for low-income families. The second point is childcare options. Many Japanese people who raise kids in France often bring up this point, saying that in France, childcare options are more accessible and affordable. Because the lack of childcare options in Japan is a serious problem, and many parents have trouble finding a place or people who can take care of their children. And many people say that France is better. So if you're French, let me know if you think it's true or not. So it seems like you get more support from the government in France. But in my opinion, the most important differences are the cultural differences. For example, after-school activities. In Japan, it's pretty common for kids to take some extra private lessons after school so that they can study even more. And this could cost anywhere from a couple of $100s to several $100s. According to a survey by an education company, 21% of fourth graders take such private classes, and the number increases up to ninth graders, and nearly 60% of them take private classes before the high school entrance exams. It's also popular to take some cultural lessons like playing musical instruments, ballet, or sports. This website estimates about 50% of elementary school children take some kind of paid lessons, and this doesn't even include sporting activities. And of course, none of those things are required, but I can easily imagine that many Japanese parents feel that they have to do so because other kids are doing it. Now, let's talk about something else, and this may seem random, but I want to talk about epidural, because I think this is a good example of the Japanese mentality. So the idea is to use anesthesia to make childbirth less painful, right? Well, this option is very unpopular in Japan. In 2007, only 2.6% of the women chose painless childbirth. Why? Because many Japanese people believe that the pain of childbirth is kind of an initiation to become mother, and it's the real way of having children. So using epidural is kind of cheating. Another similar example I want to bring up is hiring babysitters, because it's not common in Japan either. And part of the reason is that many people feel like they are cheating to pay somebody to take care of their children. So as you can see, there's a lot of cultural demand if you want to be a good parent in Japan. But in my opinion, the most important difference is family structures. I think most Japanese people think the one and only way of having children is within traditional marriage. But in France, the situation is completely different. First of all, France has this system called taux, which can be described as the lightweight version of marriage. Easier to get in, easier to get out, but you get all the benefits. So in France, fewer people are getting married, but more people choose taux. And also in France, having children outside marriage is way more common. More than half of the children born in France are outside traditional marriage, but in Japan it's less than 3%. And in Japan there's a stigma attached to it, so if you are born outside traditional marriage, you may try to hide the fact. But this does not mean that Japanese couples who are not married don't have kids. But when they do, they tend to get married for the sake of their kids. And it's also common in Japan to stay in marriage for the sake of their kids, even though they don't like their partner anymore. So the divorce rate is lower. It's 36% in Japan and 55% in France. So people's attitude is very different. Actually, when I was in France, I quickly noticed that it's common to have kids with one person, get separated, and have more kids with another person. And people are completely open about it. But if you were in the same situation in Japan, you probably wouldn't be so open about it. So I hope you can see that in Japan, the bar of having children can be pretty high because of the cultural pressure, both externally and internally. And you feel like you have to get everything right on your first attempt. And I think the fertility rates reflect those differences. But this does not necessarily mean that the French way is better than the Japanese way. I actually think that many Japanese people disapprove of the French way and prefer the Japanese way because, well, they are Japanese. But in my opinion, the traditional Japanese way of raising kids doesn't quite work well today's Japan anymore. And if we want to increase our fertility rate, we may have to think a little bit differently, even though that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be like French people. But if you're curious about how Japanese culture is different, and if you want to learn about Japanese culture more, I think the best way is to learn Japanese. And if you want to learn Japanese with me, I can send you some free lessons by email. So click the link and join my email group, Japanese with Yuta. Alright, see you guys soon. Ciao, ciao.